Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 169, and today's episode is this was a requested one for me, and it of course was requested from probably the channel's biggest viewer, that being Stormrider, requesting this one to me at least a few months ago, actually. And you can see why you're probably wondering, why was this considered a request and not something that you might have been planning on doing to begin with? Because I wasn't completely planning on doing this one to begin with as an episode, even though I do like the album. It's just that something, I don't know, but thanks to Stormrider, it really kind of brought the idea more to my attention, and the more that I thought about it, the more I'm like, you know, this really would be a pretty good episode for me, especially something for me to really dive into a bit. I'm not sure, but I know that my friend, at least online buddy, Aaron, you know, the Heavy Metal Gamer, again, who runs the Heavy Metal Gamer show, of course, a big W.A.S.P fan, I believe might have done a review episode on this one, but I think it's right now very interesting for me this time to take the time to really tackle this album, and that's, of course, you know, it is the aforementioned The Crimson Idol, which, even though this is technically was released at this point, considered the 5th studio album for, of course, W.A.S.P. However, the more that we're going to get into this album, the more that it ends up coming out, it becomes even more of a revelation that this definitely was meant to have been a Blackie Lawless solo record. And of course, I mean, it really was meant to have been a Blackie Lawless solo record, but of course, according to Blackie Lawless, he bowed down to fan pressure and released it under the W.A.S.P name, even though there's no really other members in the band that at least was on previous records besides Chris Holmes. But you understand, it's understandable there if you've at least have seen the Mean Man documentary movie about Chris Holmes. But still, even from that movie, it's also very understandably why Blackie Lawless decided to give in to the fan pressure to release this as a W.A.S.P album, because of, well, W.A.S.P has basically for years, according to like Chris Holmes and everybody else that was around him, I think even Johnny Rod, have all stated this was none other than Blackie Lawless's band to begin with. So it's just very much in the same vein as like someone like, let's say, Richie Blackmore, David Coverdale. Everyone, the musicians in the band are even the same thing. Let's say someone like John Bon Jovi. The musicians or the band members are just there. They are just the musicians, they're hired by them, you know, the singer or the person who runs the band, and is just there to kind of move along with the vision of said artist. They're not there to contribute. They're just there to perform it. And so that's why it felt very easy for Blackie Lawless to give in to the fan pressure and release The Crimson Idol as a W.A.S.P album and not as a Blackie Lawless solo album. So without further ado, let's dive into just the overview and the history that is of The Crimson Idol, which was originally released, depending on which sites you go to. Wikipedia, just if you go strictly to the page for The Crimson Idol, it just says it was released in 1992. But if you look at, let's say, scrolling down a discography page on what would be the section to where you would be able to click on The Crimson Idol, it actually kind of gives out a date, or at least a month that it was released, and it says June. However, if you go over to the Metal Archives, it actually, on this site, states that it was released on August 1st of 1992. But it's not quite certain if that is even the true date, because I've even caught Metal Archives kind of a little bit getting the months wrong on the release dates for some of these records. But either way, does it really matter after time? At this point, it's already reached its 30th anniversary. So yes, 30 years to pretty much was considered to be one of the most ambitious records from Blackie Lawless, something that nobody would have expected to kind of hear from someone like Blackie Lawless. I mean, you kind of got a little bit of the sort of serious tones and something that felt more personal during, let's say, an album like The Headless Children. But the Crimson Idol just opened up a whole new sort of door to the mind of someone like Blackie Lawless. For years, everybody pretty much remembered Blackie Lawless being this very rabid and very shocking sort of individual that would do the most craziest shit on stage, like throwing raw meat chewing up raw meat and throwing it to the audience, or strapping up at least a very scantily clad female onto a board and do fake torture and shit. People just saw this. I mean, even coming up with songs like Animal Fuck Like a Beast, all these crazy songs. But the Crimson Idol really kind of took you deep into the mind of someone like Blackie Lawless, and you really got a much more of a different sort of idea of what this guy is, and this was a really serious album, and you can tell this was more of a passion project from Blackie Lawless. This was really the beginning of a more different era of W.A.S.P. This was meant to be a Blackie Lawless solo record, but the fact that the W.A.S.P. name was slapped on it, I think really kind of opened up a bit of a different doorway for W.A.S.P. And I think from here on out, you ended up getting a much more different side of W.A.S.P. And besides, let's say, a record like Hell Dorado much later on, where it tried to be back to being the more older, more vulgar era of W.A.S.P., this one was still... This is where you really got a much more different idea of what W.A.S.P. And from here on out, this was change in lyrics. This was a change in musical style at times. I mean, though this is still a pretty heavy record, but at the same time, this was definitely the beginning of a much more deeper and more emotional version of W.A.S.P. So without further ado, let's definitely dive in to that is the Crimson Idol. So, I guess according to Blackie Lawless, at least from what I'm reading from the Wikipedia page here, let's see if I can move this a bit here. See how I can do this. I know. Apparently, this took nearly 3 years to complete. The Crimson Idol was originally recorded as a Blackie Lawless solo album, but band leader Lawless, I'm currently reading off of the Wikipedia page here, and like I stated, bowed into fan pressure and released it under the W.A.S.P. name. Now, the recording sessions for this record took place at the Fort Apache Recording Studio. I think that's what I think Apache. I don't know how to correctly pronounce that. Fucking birds. Hollywood, California. Now, it's not quite... It had to be at least sometime in maybe... It's not quite stated how long this was being recorded, because Blackie was... I think when you look at most of the people who at least recorded as far as the music and stuff, it was mostly... He at least mostly recorded most of the vocals, rhythm guitar, keyboards, and bass. However, Frankie Banali, again, the late Frankie Banali of like Quiet Riot, performed a lot of the drums on the record. Bob Kulick performed most of the lead guitar on the record. However, There's one song on the album where Doug Aldrich, who is uncredited on the album, again, later on becoming a guitar, a member of Whitesnake, he at least, again, very uncredited. Even a guy named Stet Howland is uncredited. But he definitely had some help in some of the department to really kind of help finish out the recording. But again, it's not really quite stated how. However, I'm just going to assume that it had to at least been within 3 years, but I think this was being finished at least sometime in early of 1992 and eventually in June. Obviously, it had to have been June of 1992 where this was released, because according to the critical reception section of the page on Wikipedia here for the album, apparently in a German magazine, again, Rock Hard, declared the album, the Crimson Idol album, album of the month in June of 1992. So it pretty much already states that this was released in 1992. So therefore, the August 1st date for freaking Metal Archives has it out is wrong. Once again, people over at the freaking Metal Archives don't know what the hell they're doing these days, and they don't know exactly what's the true freaking month or release date anymore. They just guesstimate the bullshit. But here we go. Eventually, it gets released in June of 1992, like I'm stating, and of course through Parlophone and Capitol Records and so on. Again, since obviously Blackie was still contractually obligated to Capitol Records still. This was a much more different record. And I think why this really feels much more like a passion project is because of this really was the first ambitious record from Blackie Lawless. Because this really ended up being a concept record. It really... Technically, this is pretty much about a story of someone named Jonathan Steele. However, there's definitely a lot of theories around this that this might have been a partially autobiography record for Blackie Lawless himself. Like he might have took some of his sort of past upbringings and kind of really injected it into the sort of story for this record. And I mean, every sort of writer and director does that with most of some of their movies, that they will inject some of their personal life into the sort of slightly made up story that they're coming up with. I don't like to use the word made up, but it's just like something, that they're creating, but they do put a little bit of their personal, life, a little bit of their personal situations and stuff into either a character or into the story itself. And in the case of something like Jonathan Steele, the main, I don't know if you can say antagonist, but the main character in the story here for the Crimson Idol, you really can kind of get a little bit of Blackie Lawless's sort of personal upbringing into the character. Where almost in a way kind of at times might have been really hauntingly mirroring the sort of situation of Blackie Lawless a bit here. But the overall, I guess as far as characters we have in this story, we have, like Jonathan Aaron Steele, Michael Steele, Jonathan's late brother, Elizabeth Steele, the mother of Jonathan, and of course a William Red Steele, the father of Jonathan. Then of course we have the Mirror, Chainsaw Charlie, Alex Rodman, the Gypsy, Dr. Rockter, and of course the King of Mercy are all the list of characters besides Jonathan in that are part of this story that Blackie Lawless came up with for the Crimson Idol. Now also I should bring up too is that a movie was supposed to have accompanied the release of the album here. There was supposed to have been a movie, and they at least shot at least 50 minutes worth of footage, and again, it was going to be 50 minutes pretty much at the same length of the album, where most of the songs were going to play alongside the footage in this film. basically meaning one long, music video in a way. Not to the extent of, probably kind of a much more shorter and more streamlined version, let's say like Pink Floyd The Wall, the movie at least, where it kind of did I guess it might have been a very similar thing, but again, Blackie Lawless was definitely inspired by a lot of concept records. For one of them, I think the biggest inspiration for this album was definitely Tommy from The Who, and he does state right here when it came to the overall concepts for the Crimson Idol that The Who's Pete Townsend, again, apparently, I guess, encouraged him to go for it. So I guess there might have been a point in time where I guess there might have been, I don't know, but that where Blackie Lawless actually, I think, bumped into Pete Townsend and probably asked him about the whole concept album thing and probably told him the idea of what he had for a concept record. And I think, if anything, that's where it probably was given the talk there and the encouragement of just going for it. And that's why this ended up becoming such a huge passion project for him. And that's why we eventually got it. But eventually, here we go with the concept record, and it definitely was a much more different style record. Now, since I pretty much had told you a lot of the characters that are basically found in the story for the Crimson Idol, we definitely should get into the story itself. Now, I'm going to try my best to read off the story and go through as much bullet points as possible too, but I'll definitely at least get down as much of the story without... Hopefully, at this point, you probably might have heard the album anyways, but it definitely is a pretty interesting story in its own right, and I think it's definitely worth checking out to begin with. But right now, for those who probably have listened to the album, you probably are not going to feel like anything has been spoiled in the story, so you probably have I would say it should be no problem you to really hear me run through the overall concept and the story that is the Crimson Idol. But for those who haven't probably listened to the Crimson Idol and are probably just right now are just jumping onto my video here and right now are probably getting into this portion of the video, if you want to save yourself the story of the album, you probably could skip this section, and I'll probably do my best to kind of give you where to end this part of the video in a way, or at least skip over to where you probably should be able to skip over and just continue on from there, from listening to this episode. But for those who probably have listened to this record, just... let's all move along, just continue on. So, the story of the Crimson Idol revolves around a teenager named Jonathan. He is the son of William and Elizabeth Steele and brother of Michael Steele. Michael is the favored son of his parents, and Jonathan is a complete failure in their eyes. Again, resentment towards Jonathan Aaron Steele. On Jonathan's 14th birthday, Michael, the brother, is sadly killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. This, of course, becomes one of the main driving forces for Jonathan in the story here, due to the overwhelming succumsion of agony. He couldn't bring himself at all to go to the funeral of Michael, and from there, even though the parents had already has so much resentment towards Jonathan, this even brought more resentment onto Jonathan, and from there on, Jonathan runs away from home and starts to wander the streets, becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol. While walking past a music store, he sees a guitar and desires to become a rock star. He breaks the display window with a bottle of booze, thus beginning his journey into acclaim excess. Jonathan plays the stolen crimson-colored guitar as often as he can in order to obtain money to record an album. He then meets a man named Chainsaw Charlie, which then becomes the basis for the song Chainsaw Charlie, Murders in the New Morgue song on the album. The president of a major record label For all we know, could be Capitol Records that Blackie Lawless is probably referring to at the time. Charlie promises to make Jonathan a star and introduces him to Alex Rodman, who will become his manager. Jonathan goes on to achieve his ambition of becoming a rock star, but finds out that life is not as glamorous as it seems. Despite now having fame and fortune, he still longs for the one thing he always wanted, that being the love and acceptance of his parents, which, if you actually listen to, let's say, the track that ended up becoming a bonus track on a lot of the reissues for this album, which is called The Story of Jonathan, parentheses, prologue to the Crimson Idol, he goes, this really goes into more depth of at least a phone call between Jonathan and his parents, and it was pretty much a very heartbreaking conversation, because even after years of pretty much having run away from home and still them not getting over the fact that he could not go to his own brother's funeral, and Jonathan felt very much heartbroken by the fact that his parents had resented him for years. They still are resenting him even more, and probably to the point to where, was it pretty much from the conversation, his mother basically said, "We have no son." And from there on, it just really kind of tore down Jonathan. And so on one night before a concert, that's, of course, I guess, leads into that. Again, he just realized that he will never be accepted by his parents. Jonathan decides to commit suicide. During the aforementioned concert, he removes the strings from his guitar, shapes them into a noose, and hangs himself. And again, the whole track, that is The Story of Jonathan, parentheses, prologue to the Crimson Idol, really just goes into more depth of some of this story. But it is definitely one of the most, and there's even parts into the story that it even ends up bringing up, and that's, of course, how one night, he apparently, I guess, after being visited by someone named the Doctor, I guess this could be the Dr. Rocker, I guess it's from, at least he looked, I think this is what he's referring to, and that's apparently in the mirror. He's basically in the mirror, he looks at himself, but instead he's not really looking at himself, he's looking at somebody else, and that's where he pretty much sees that, I guess, the person that actually might be inside him. I'm not quite sure exactly, but it seems like that's where a lot of the, I guess you could say, analogies for the depression and the overall excess really comes into it. He's finally just seeing the darkest fears of himself inside the mirror and pretty much starts speaking to it, or bellies back, and they all basically having a conversation. But it's really one of the most pretty interesting stories, and it's a really dark story as well. And again, the way how it ends is a really sort of dark way to really end a story. Committing suicide just on the stage and everything, but that's where I guess this might all be analogies for other things, and this really felt like all the dark times, I think, in Blackie Lawless's period. I think the fact that maybe the sort of checkered friendship between him and Chris Holmes, and then of course the stuff with a lot of the PMRC, and then of course the whatever issues there was with the record label, I think this all was becoming big inspirations for at least Blackie Lawless, and especially for a story like the Crimson Idol. And so this is why this really was a much more of a different sort of tone that anyone would have expected from Blackie, and it really kind of gave everybody, especially the audience, a much more deeper look into the personal side of Blackie Lawless. It really did, and you got a different personality from him, and it really is a pretty interesting as story that it is. And of course the album itself, for a concept record, I mean, there's also a very good point that Blackie could have been inspired by, let's say, an album like Operation Mindcrime by Queensryche. He could have very well been inspired by that and wanted to kind of do something in the sort of same vein in terms of having, let's say, reenactments kind of go along in some songs before, they start and everything. Like there's even like a little bit of a part between, I forgot what song it was. It could have been The Idol, actually. It could have been The Idol. And where there was like a complete scene between, I guess had to have been at like some sort of little restaurant or something, or diner. And, obviously ordering some food. Could be breakfast time for all we know, or dinner time. But it's not quite. But I have to take it. It could be morning time. And I guess he runs into the manager Alex Rodman, and apparently Alex Rodman just berates Jonathan, to where it's like, look at all the people you're surrounding with, and all the disgusting people and everything, and it's like you're nothing more than a complete failure. And somebody just berates him in a way, and it's like, this is I guess the complete deterioration between the overall business ship between Alex Rodman and, of course, Jonathan Aaron Steele. So it just everything just completely just goes haywire. But it's definitely a really interesting story, and the album itself is great. There's definitely since right now this is probably the point where it'd be the most best time right now to really kind of continue on for those who have never really listened to the Crimson Idol, but might be interested and don't want to be spoiled by a lot of the story of the record. So this is probably where I pretty much lead you to right now. So it's definitely a pretty good record nonetheless. I mean, it does have its interludes and stuff like most of these concept records. But as far as when it comes to the actual songs on the album, the actual music, it's still a fairly heavy record. And there's even a part of me that feels like that Blackie could have also been very much inspired by the musical talents and stuff, and just the riffs and stuff of like Iron Maiden in a way. Like I do get a little bit of an Iron Maiden vibe from some of these songs, especially like The Invisible Boy and Arena of a Pleasure and Chainsaw Charlie, and just some of these songs. I do get definitely plenty of Iron Maiden influences musically in some of these songs. Like he definitely could have been very much inspired by what they were doing, even musically, from like, for example, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son and Somewhere in Time and Power Slave and Peace of Mind and that. I think he probably had to have been somewhat inspired by that, because it's definitely still a very much a heavy metal record. Just that compared to something, let's say, like Operation Mindcrime from Queensryche, he definitely goes in a much more different, he really went into a different direction creatively with the Crimson Idol, where instead of being around conspiracies and religious conspiracies or government conspiracies and stuff that Operation Mindcrime pretty much dealt with, this one deals with more of just the hard excess of mostly the overall rock and roll scene that it was in the 80s, probably taken a little bit of inspiration too from, let's say, like the Decline of Western Civilization, the Metal Years film, especially dealing with the whole overall scene with Chris Holmes and that. It seemed like that Blackie really had a lot of pent-up emotion about the overall situation that a lot of the rock bands in that time of the overall self-destruction, and how every one of those hair bands began to split up because they're all at each other's throats, the overall stuff with Motley Crue and all of that. I think he really took some of that lifestyle and really kind of brought it into the overall writing of the album. It's funny that when that Martin Popoff of course, the Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal slags this album so much, when in fact I think he kind of misses the point of, I think, the album in itself. And of course he's a very weird guy to begin with, and his opinions are a little bit weird to me. He's an odd individual. But it's just something how anybody would try and trash and even make a lot of bold and very out there statements about how this is almost hurtful to the concept album idea, the something like, again, like Operation Mindcrimes in the world, how it's like this is a hurtful record to that style in a way and to that concept. I think those are really wild and very bold claims, but also ones I do not share at all. And I think kind of shows that he's probably a little bit too overzealous in a way when he comes up with that. And I mean, not that I expect an album like this to please everybody else, and I don't think this was probably meant to please everybody, but to just make those kind of claims, I think is kind of a bit of an ass kind of statement to make. But I think what it is like you're kind of forgetting, or you're overlooking the overall point of what Blackie was probably trying to do with this record in a way. Yes, this definitely didn't really much feel like an actual W.A.S.P album and more like a Blackie Lawless record, but I think the fact that he went that far to slap it onto it was, I think, a pretty interesting move, and I think it really ended up really changing the overall landscape for W.A.S.P. I think it really kind of changed and introduced something else to the sound. I think even more reinvented W.A.S.P sound from here on out. A lot of the albums, for the most part, were going to be a little more darker, a little more serious. Like, he was definitely putting some more extra effort. I mean, look at Still Not Black Enough. So, how everything, musically, it all was changing in a way. And of course, in the 2000s, he kind of pretty much resurrected the concept album idea again with, let's say, what was the New Gods, Part 1 and Part 2 album, which I do have as well. I have those. But yeah, the Neon God, actually. With the Neon Gods, Parts 1 and Part 2 stuff. It's like, which feels more like a spiritual successor to, like, the Crimson Idol. Like, he really wanted to kind of pretty much see if he can strike gold twice with something like the Neon God albums in a way. He wanted, which was meant to have been a double record, but due to, I guess, budget reasons, it all ended up getting released separately. I guess in a way, almost kind of taking. It felt like like a weird inspiration from like Metallica with Load and Reload, which were all meant to have been double albums themselves too when they were first were released, but somehow ended up getting released as separate albums instead of as part of one package. So that ended up becoming the same scenario for, I would say, for the Neon God albums. But that's how long it took for Blackie Lawless to kind of really revisit the concept album idea. And I think those are also good albums as well, the Neon God. The thing is, you have to kind of listen to those two albums as one album in a way. You have to listen to them at the same time. You can't just listen to them separately. You almost have to listen to those as one album in a way. Like disc 1, disc 2, you can't just wait a day or something and listen to, you kind of almost have to listen to that as one album in a way. Repeating myself, word-like. But yeah, there's just some really good freaking tracks on this one. Now, I do need to bring this one up as well, since we're speaking about later era stuff and revisiting Blackie, of course, over time, how he got really. I guess he's always was kind of weird when it came to this because of he sometimes, like early on, was it when reading into his backstory, at age 11, he actually became born again. But then eventually he then started going into being more different. He started getting a little more rebellious. I guess later on, he's now born re-again in a way, or so reborn again, or some shit. And to where he started to basically going down the path of someone like Dave Mustaine, where it's like now he's he's not going to play certain songs again, and it's like, or he might play songs, but he might change lyrics, or if he can't change the lyrics, he's just not going to play the song, the yada yada yada. Like he ain't gonna. You're not going to hear Blackie Lawless probably not. I've known, and it might have been tickled with here and there. And as far as the most recent tour, I'm not quite sure if Animal Fuck Like a Beast is ever going to make it back into the set list again. But either way, as far as songs that might have been a little bit on the very edgy side than in terms of, say, foul language and stuff, Blackie will definitely play those songs, but there was a point in time where, up until recently, he was mostly changing the lyrics of some of his songs, especially in the case of Chainsaw Charlie, Murders in the New Morgue. He changed some of the foul language in the song and kind of just made it different, he made it more clean in a way. However, most recently on the recent tour, Blackie decided to revert back to all the original lyrics of Chainsaw Charlie, and that means actually bringing back all the foul language. So it seems like Blackie here and there will get a change of heart and actually kind of revert things back to what they were to, and just for something, for the audience, knowing that the audience are basically one of the main things, but at the same time, who knows whether or not, if he's going to go as far as, let's say, bring back something like Animal Fuck Like a Beast, you don't know if he's going to replay that again just because of the content and the song and the title and everything. Because again, he's just become such a reborn again Christian these days. But the fact that now that he's basically brought back a lot of the original lyrics to Chainsaw Charlie, it seems like he might have a change of heart and might start playing some of the earlier stuff again. But again, I don't think you'll ever expect him, let's say, doing any sort of shows with Chris Holmes again. After watching the Mean Man documentary, it's definitely a much more broken relationship there. And a lot of stuff that's definitely been said, and a lot of other things, like other sort of information that really kind of also paints Blackie Lawless in a really bad light. And and at the same time, also being very sympathetic for somebody like Chris Holmes in some way, But again, it's always up to interpretation sometimes, But either way, it's all just crazy shit to begin with. But at the end of the day, we at least have a pretty good concept album in The Crimson Idol. And this definitely was a really good freaking record to begin with. And just not really a bad song on this album. It's a very interesting concept. And I think it's definitely one of, I would say, either W.A.S.P's or Blackie's best albums, and it's a really good record from beginning to begin with. It's a great track. I think the one song that probably should have been on the album itself would have been Phantoms in the Mirror, just because of it probably plays into a part of the story, especially the whole mirror story, where he all of a sudden starts talking to himself in a way. It's like that probably should have been as part of the album, but I probably can see maybe it was for time constraints, even though this was 1992. Compact discs were still becoming a big physical media, and the length you can put onto a CD was like limitless. So he could have fit at least a song or two onto the album itself. He could add. Either way, it's what we got. So there you have it. There's The Crimson Idol from W.A.S.P, or Blackie Lawless. Again, thanks to Stormrider for recommending this as an Album of the Week episode. So there we go. Again, it's a good album. I definitely recommend checking the album out. So there we go. I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.